Hi friends, I'm Jeffy G. I've been doing an inventory of all the plugins and virtual instruments I've acquired over the last, 6 to 10 years. And you know what I found? I have 242 plugin effects. Do I use them all? Heck no. But what I have found is that they fall into 3 categories, and it relates to the process of composing and recording a song. So in this video, I'm going to show you the ones I actually use and break them down into those categories. And that could give you some perspective for managing your own library of plugins going forward. Here are the 3 categories for the plugins. Category 1 are plugins used for tracking and recording. Category 2 are plugins that you use to arrange and create that initial mix, and these you probably use over and over again. Category 3 are the special effects or sound design plugins. These are the fun ones, the unique ones, plugins that you might only use once or once in a while. That first category is for recording and tracking, and I rely heavily on Universal Audio plugins and my Apollo X4 for that process. So here's what it looks like. I've got the UAD console up and running here. What matters here is how simple I'm keeping the vocal chain. I'm using the UAD 610B. It's a very simple channel strip, but I like its simplicity. I also like that it adds a certain amount of color to the recording, but not too much. And then from there, I've got an LA2A. I'm using the LA2A Silver with kind of a minimal amount of initial compression just to get a good quality vocal recording. And beyond that, I might use the Pultec EQ. It depends on what microphone I'm using. Really, the only EQ I add on the way in is to compensate for the characteristics of different microphones. You know, if I've got a microphone that's particularly harsh at the high end, I might cut off some of the high frequencies, and I may roll off some of the low frequencies on a microphone just to narrow the band. The other 2 things I might use is, you can see I've got the Oxide tape in the vocal chain. It adds just a little bit of saturation and color. I do have the auto-tune, Antares auto-tune open here, but you'll see I often don't have that turned on. I've experimented many times on whether to do auto-tune on the way in on a recording or do it later. And my preference is to do it later in the DAW. And then there's 2 other things that I use. I use the Pure Plate Reverb, just so that singers can get reverb through their headphone mix. And I really like the Galaxy Tape Echo. So for delay and reverb, I'm sticking again with 2 UAD plugins that are pretty standard. And that's about all I use. Do I have other channel strips? Yeah, I have the API Vision channel strip. You can see it here, and it has a very different sound than the 610B. It's a more modern, clean sound, and built into that channel strip is a bunch of features beyond just EQ. It's got a gate and a limiter, and it's got its own compression. This is pretty much what came with the Heritage Collection from Universal Audio when you buy an Apollo interface. So I bought the API Vision channel strip. It came with Century Tube channel strip, the Helios 69, the 610A and B, and the V76. I think there may be 1 or 2 others in there, but these are the primary channel strips that are Unison amp enabled. For the tracking process and recording any acoustic sounds, I'm really only using 4 or 5 plugins. In fact, I often get by with 2, a channel strip and a compressor, and I pretty much stick to the LA2A or an 1176. I stick with what was delivered because, well, I'm pretty cheap. My real focus on that recording process is just to get good quality sound into my DAW, and then I'll do all of the processing and add all the special effects later. In category 1, a lot of the plugins I'm using are from Universal Audio, and that's because I have an Apollo audio interface. And just as a reminder, I'm really only using Pure Plate Reverb and the Galaxy Echo for the purposes of giving the vocalist feedback, monitoring feedback. But you'll see I do use those plugins later in the arranging and mixing. Outside of the Apollo environment, there are 2 other channel strips that I like quite a bit. One is the Lindell 80 series, which is a Neve 1073 emulation. And the other one is from Brainworks. It's their SSL Console 4000E. These are very different. The Neve has the classic kind of 70s console warm sound, and the SSL has a more modern capability that's very clear and can be used for a big variety of music. The second category, or the second phase in which I use plugins, I stick with kind of a standard set. I've got reverb, delay, secondary compression, EQ, de-essing. I may bring into play auto-tune or pitch correction. I tend to use a combination of plugins that were delivered by Logic, they were included in my DAW, and some third-party plugins. Now for category 2, keep in mind that these are the plugins I'm going to use repeatedly when I do that initial mix and I'm still working on the arrangement of a composition. So I'm going to stick with Logic because it's my preferred DAW. I'm going to use the channel EQ right out of the gate on almost every channel. And the only reason I'm going to look beyond the channel EQ is I'm trying to do something that it can't do. So another EQ that comes in Logic is this vintage tube EQ, and it has a really warm sound, slightly different controls, reminiscent of a Pultec, similar to what I was using in the tracking process. I may take a look at the TRD Nova EQ from time to time because it has some dynamic capabilities that are very similar to FabFilter. And I don't own FabFilter, so it's my third choice here for doing strategic surgery on EQ where there's perhaps a bad frequency or a boxy sound that I'm trying to eliminate. For compression, and remember this is secondary compression because I've already used an LA2A or an 1176 when I was doing the recording, I'm okay with the Logic compressor. It has many different modes. I find it to be very flexible, and it adds the compression sound that I'm looking for. I'll use the Logic DeEsser. Sometimes I will use the DeEsser from Universal Audio, but the Logic one does the trick. I'll use the Logic limiter. And I'll start my auto-tune adjustments, if they are necessary, again with the Logic pitch correction tool. But what I find sometimes is it isn't sophisticated enough, and so I might move over to the Antares auto-tune real-time tool. I've had really good luck with that. What I like about it in particular is that you do not hear the auto-tune very much. Now when it comes to reverbs and delays, it gets a little complicated. I typically don't use just one. I may use ChromaVerb quite a bit for, just standard reverb on drums or on a snare, but I might move up to the Space Designer from Logic for vocals. Beyond the Logic tools, I like RAUM from Native Instruments. It's a different sounding reverb. It is very crisp, and I like some of the controls on that, so I might use that. And as I mentioned at the start, I like the Pure Plate Reverb that comes from Universal Audio. And with delays, same thing. Logic offers a couple varieties of delays. I like the stereo delay in particular, especially if you're trying to synchronize your delays with the tempo of the music. And I'll still use the Galaxy Tape Echo from Universal Audio, which I mentioned earlier. I keep using the exact same reverbs and delays repeatedly because I know how they work and I know what to expect. They're easy to manage, and this is just giving me a baseline mix that I'm using for arranging and composing the song. Anything that I want to do fancy, I'm going to do later in category 3. So category 3 goes far beyond the basics of mixing your composition or song. These are the special effects that are going to make some parts of your song unique, and that's why there's a big variety of third-party vendors involved in this. One of the standouts, and you'll see this all over YouTube, is from Vahalla, the Supermassive product, which is primarily a reverb, but goes beyond a lot of what reverb and echo might normally do. Has some really bizarre sounds in it, and it's free, so it's worth getting. Another one in that category is called Dustbin from Caelum Audio. It's quite unique in that it's a speaker and a microphone in a garbage bin, and you can adjust the distance between the microphone and the speaker. I just like it. It has kind of a hollow sound. It's fairly unique. Again, it sounds a bit like reverb, but it is different and not something that you hear typically on any recording. Another one I like is called PitchProof. Now, PitchProof is a pitch correcting tool, but I don't use it on vocals. I use it on guitar and other instruments where I want to double up the sounds in harmonies. It has a bunch of standard harmonies in it, like thirds and fifths and sevenths. You pick the key and it will add all those additional parts. It's very easy to use and the quality seems to be quite good. Another Vahalla tool that's unbelievable is Valhalla's SpaceModulator. So lots of plugins do modulation. This one has a lot of presets that will give you very unique results. You could use this on a keyboard part, you could use this on a brass part, you can add it in with strings, and if you want to really experiment, put it on top of vocals. Another one that falls into that category is called Deelay with 2 E's. This one is over the top bizarre. If you're looking to add color in terms of delay and echo, this has it all. It plays in reverse, it has filtering, it has some timed based effects that will really mess up your sounds and make them unique, but it's a lot of fun to play with. I never get bored with delay. Another quick one is from Isotope called Vinyl. This one has a couple of neat features you might reuse. One is, the scratching effects that you might get on a record, sort of DJ effects. And it has one that just slows down the entire pitch of a song and speeds it back up. So you can slow things down, speed them up. Another one I might add is something called Fresh Air. Fresh Air is, in my mind, similar to the sound you get from a Focusrite audio interface. They have a button on there called Air that adds certain high frequencies to give it more headroom or the feeling of more headroom without messing up the EQ you might have already built into your track. There's another quick one called Wider. There's lots of stereo spread effects out there. The one from Logic does the trick too. I just find this one kind of interesting. It takes it to another level and it has a bigger variety of presets. In this category, there's another one that I use from AudioThing called the Orb. They make some really interesting plugins. You'll see that they can really change your sound and add something unique into your song. Now, in addition to those, there are a bunch of Logic plugins that I will use for the same purpose, special effects or sound design. Ensemble is included in Logic, and it is a very sophisticated chorus with multiple parts and multiple voices. So if you're looking to fatten up vocals, or add even 5 parts to a vocal or a background and make it sound thick, this is a great way to do it. You can use this on guitar or bass and other purposes as well. I mentioned Logic has a stereo spread. There's a multi-effects unit from Logic called Phat FX. In particular, a lot of people like the distortion and saturation that you can add with this. It's made up of 9 different effects that you can turn off and on, and they work in concert with one another. Now, something that Logic has that a lot of other vendors don't have is an emulation of a Leslie, that rotation effect. So they have that as a plugin. It's not just in their virtual instruments, but you can put anything through a Leslie. So back in the 60s, people like Jimi Hendrix used to play guitar through a Leslie. You can do that here and get similar results, or you can play bass through there. Any kind of keyboard sound that perhaps doesn't have that rotation effect built into the synthesis, you can add this plugin to get that rotation effect. There's a vocal transformer, there's a variety of those that are available, but the one that comes from Logic works pretty well. For a lot of the recording and tracking process, I tend to use virtual instruments. Virtual drums, virtual synths, different sampled instruments from various vendors. For those, I tend not to use plugins when I'm in the recording process. I tend to use them just as they sound, either through presets or tweaking within the software itself, but I'm not really bringing into play third-party plugins or even plugins from my DAW. Occasionally, I do use external synths. You can see some back here. And for those, I plug them directly into a Motu 8 Pre that has ADAT, and it feeds into my Apollo X4. And so I have a direct connection. It's analog, not digital, but I don't feel it's necessary to add a compressor or EQ at that stage in the process. I tend to use those sounds straight out of the synth the way they were delivered. There's one more category that I didn't mention off the top, and I'm going to call it Category 4. These are the one-button solutions. Some of these products hinge on artificial intelligence, or they're just utilities that I have used for a specific purpose, but they are delivered as a plugin. One of them is from Waves. It's called NS1, and it is a sound reduction, a noise reduction type tool. If you're ever converting audio files from tape or from another source and you want to get rid of the hiss or any background noise, this is one of those all-in-one tools where you just increase the threshold and it does its job. It works really well. In that same category is something called Nectar Plus 3 from Isotope. Isotope is perhaps a leader in this AI space. But these products come with an assistant that will analyze your music and then set things like pitch control, EQ, compressor, reverb, a sum of all the plugins that you've seen so far, all in one tool. That can be very powerful. I've used Nectar 3 on vocal tracks and found it to be really effective. In particular, the EQ is very sophisticated. It's dynamic. It has many points. And quite often, when you use the assistant, it'll create two EQ settings. One that surgically reduces the undesirable frequencies, and then another EQ that emphasizes the strengths of the performance, perhaps the vocal performance if you're using this on vocals. On the other side is mastering, which I don't do a lot of mastering, but there are some good plugins out there that will help you do mastering. The first one I tried is called Master Desk from Plugin Alliance, and it's built by Brainworks, and it's very good. It's kind of a one-button solution. You make some small adjustments, it has presets, and you'll get a reasonable result. But perhaps the king of the mastering world here is again another Isotope product that's called Ozone 10. And this product, similarly to Nectar, analyzes your music, creates quite a few changes on your master tracks for EQ and volume setting and peak management. And inevitably, it's a very inexpensive way for you to master a recording, a song, or a composition that you've been working on. Both of them are great. They're not inexpensive, but they work really well. One takeaway you might have is that some of my choices for plugins are being driven by the hardware that I use in the recording process. And I've tried to make that linkage between the process of creating a song, adding special effects at the end, and coming up with something unique. But at the end of the day, it's a lot of personal choice, what it is that you like and the way you like a particular reverb to sound. Another factor to consider is how effective you are with those plugins. A lot of people like FabFilter because they can do the kind of surgery they want to do on EQ very quickly. If this kind of information is useful to you in your music production endeavors, click on the like button. Consider subscribing to the channel and click the notification bell. I like comments, so if you have things to say, something to offer, maybe tell me your favorite plugins and why you use them, add it into the comments. Thanks for watching.